Hey guys, tonight we settle into the soft glow of candlelight in 18th century London, where the air is thick with smoke from chimneys, and the cobbled streets echo faintly with carriage wheels long after the sun has slipped away. You're about to slip into the quiet life of a woman named Hester Bateman, a widow who, against all expectation, carved her name into the silver of Georgian England. And trust me, you probably won't survive this. Not because it's dangerous, but because it's boring in exactly the kind of way that makes your eyelids heavy and your head tilt toward the pillow. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your location and the exact time you're listening. It's oddly comforting to know that somewhere out there, scattered across the world, people are drifting off to sleep to the same story at the same moment. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Hester Needham, who would become Hester Bateman, was born into the hum of London in 1708. Her family was ordinary, and the kind of ordinariness that tends to slip out of historical record. Historians still argue whether her father was a labourer, a small tradesman, or simply one of those countless names lost to time. What we know is that she grew up in the city at a moment when London itself was swelling, fed by trade, crafts, and the energy of a capital that already dreamed of ruling the world. For young Hester, life would not have looked glamorous. It would have been a pattern of small domestic duties, long market days, and the everyday details that never make it into textbooks. By the 1730s, she had married a man named John Bateman. He wasn't a lord, or a scholar, or even a particularly wealthy merchant. He was a working silversmith, part of a trade that straddled both artistry and utility. Their home, like many of the city's artisan houses, was both residence and workshop. Imagine the soundscape of her daily life. The tap of hammers against silver, the smell of coal smoke, and the clutter of apprentices learning their trade while she handled meals and children under the same roof. It was noisy, messy, and oddly calming in its consistency. London silversmiths in that period didn't only make ornate teapots or ceremonial pieces. Most of their bread and butter work was far more ordinary. Simple spoons, forks, buckles, buttons, and small decorative fittings kept the household in business. The idea that a spoon might have been passed from hand to hand, polished to a shine, and finally stamped with a maker's mark in the Bateman home, that S, the kind of detail that makes history feel small enough to touch. But the early years of her marriage were marked by the quiet vulnerability of a woman tethered to her husband's trade. If John thrived, so did she. If he faltered, so would her children. In 18th century London, a widow without skill or trade connections could easily sink into poverty. And that was the turn her life took in 1760, when John Bateman died, leaving Hester alone with a household and a workshop that might just as easily collapse as survive. Widowhood at that time wasn't simply an emotional blow, it was an economic earthquake. Many women remarried quickly, if only for survival. But Hester chose a different path. She stepped into the workshop, a space that until then had been her husband's domain, and quietly began managing it herself. For the record keepers of the age, this wasn't remarkable enough to earn much comment. For us, drifting here centuries later, it est precisely the quietness that est fascinating. The image of a woman in a plain dress, sleeves rolled, keeping alive a business no one thought she would run. There is a curious historical fact tucked into this moment. Hester officially registered her Silversmith S-mark with the London Assay Office in 1761. That was the year her initial simply HB became stamped onto silver. For collectors today, that little HB hallmark is worth noting. But for her, it was probably less about prestige and more about survival. Without the mark, she couldn't legally sell silverware in London. With it, she gained legitimacy. It was paperwork that kept food on the table. Historians still argue whether she was already experienced at the bench, or whether she relied on hired hands to handle most of the heavy silksmithing. The truth, buried under the dust of time, is probably a blend. She was certainly no stranger to the tools, but her strength lay in management, organizing the workshop, training her children, and keeping the family afloat. One quirky detail about London at the time: silver wasn't just about wealth. It was seen as hygienic. People genuinely believed silver utensils could ward off illness, since the metal had antibacterial properties. So when Hester continued the family trade, she wasn't just selling pretty cutlery, she was, in her customers' eyes, contributing to their health. You might say she was the 18th century equivalent of someone running a home air purifier business. Practical, invisible, and faintly ridiculous in hindsight, yet deeply comforting to the people who bought in. Picture her evenings. After a day of hammering, filing, and polishing, she would sit in a modest room, children gathered, candles burning low. The city outside was alive with cries of street hawkers, the rumble of carts, and the faint chiming of church bells. Inside, silver objects cooled on benches, tiny spoons gleaming faintly in the flicker of the fire. She was, without ever intending to be, weaving her name into history, not through grand gestures, but through persistence. The widow's life was one of restraint and endurance. No flashy memoir, no scandalous correspondence, no court intrigue, just work, meals, family, and a growing recognition that her household could hold its own in a world dominated by men with louder voices. That is the beauty of her Svoriet, so utterly unremarkable in the eyes of her contemporaries that it slips into the category of sleep-inducing history we savor here. Silver, for Hester, was a medium of continuity. Each finished spoon, each polished teapot lid, each quiet sale in the marketplace was another step away from despair. London was full of widows who sank into obscurity. Hester Bateman, instead, picked up her hammer, registered her hallmark, and pressed her initials into metal that would outlast her. And as you drift further into this story, you might find the same rhythm her life carried. Steady, repetitive, softened by the passing years. A spoon is struck. A spoon is polished. A spoon is sold. Again and again, until the noise fades into something like silence. When you imagine London in the mid-1700s, Don't picture a neat, postcard-ready city. Instead, think of smoke-clogged alleys, the sour tang of tanneries drifting through the air, and the constant chatter of hawkers who seemed to never lose their voices. This was the city Hester Bateman lived in, and more importantly, it was the city whose silversmithing world she had just stepped into. A world that, at first glance, looked closed to her because it was. Silversmithing in London wasn't just a craft. It was a regulated industry, guarded carefully by guilds and the all-important worshipful company of goldsmiths. If you wanted to make a living from shaping silver, you couldn't just set up a bench and hammer away. Every single piece of silverware above a certain weight had to be tested, stamped, and officially assayed. Without that mark, it wasn't legal. This gave London silver a reputation for quality, but it also meant the trade was wrapped in layers of formality. For someone like Hester, a widow with children and little formal training, entering that system was like walking into a men's club where the doorman had already decided you didn't belong. The guild world was full of hierarchy. At the top were master silversmiths, many of them with sprawling workshops employing apprentices and journeymen. Below them were smaller household shops, like the Batemans, where family members worked side by side, filing, polishing, and hammering out the day's orders. The rules of the guild favored men naturally. Women were allowed in under certain conditions, usually as widows, keeping their late husband's business afloat until a son was old enough to take over. It wasn't expected to be permanent. Widows were placeholders, not pioneers. But Hester wasn't simply a placeholder. When she registered her mark HB in 1761, she wasn't asking for a brief extension. She was planting a flag in a space no one really wanted her to occupy. And that meant she had to understand not only the work of silver, but also the complex dance of industry politics. Here's a mainstream historical fact worth slipping in. By the 1750s, London was producing more silverware than any other European city. Wealthy households demanded matching sets of forks, spoons, and candlesticks. Georgian dining tables practically glimmered under candlelight. And it wasn't only the rich, middle-class families aspiring to gentility stretched their budgets for a few good pieces of silver, if only to display them proudly when guests visited. The demand was there. The competition to supply it was fierce. For Hester, that competition was sharpened by whispers. A woman's hallmark was rare, and it didn't go unnoticed. Historians still argue whether her male colleagues treated her with condescension, outright hostility, or grudging respect. Some records hint at resentment. A widow's name turning up in commissions that should have gone to men. Others suggest a kind of amused tolerance, as if she were dabbling in a trade that would soon outpace her. Either way, she endured. Inside her world, the tools were as important as the silver itself. Imagine the clatter of hammers striking tiny punches, the sharp hiss of molten silver poured into molds, the scrape of files smoothing rough edges. Workshops were dark, smoky spaces where light filtered in through small windows, catching on half-finished spoons and decorative bowls. Apprentices worked long hours, their hands calloused from the relentless labor. Hester, as the head of her household shop, had to oversee not only the making of objects, but also the disciplining of hands. A dropped spoon meant wasted metal. A flawed piece could mean rejection at the assay office. Every ounce counted. There's a quirky tidbit buried in the lore of London silver. Some silversmiths in that era tried to cheat by alloying too much copper into their silver. When caught, their work was literally destroyed at the assay office, sawed apart or hammered flat, a public humiliation. For Hester, whose livelihood depended on the reputation of her small workshop, such risks weren't worth taking. She had neither the margin for error nor the appetite for scandal. Her pieces had to pass inspection every single time. At the same time, the silver industry wasn't just about technical skill. It was about keeping up with taste. Georgian style was shifting. Gone were the heavily ornate Baroque designs of the previous century. Now, people wanted clean lines, symmetry, and understated elegance. Perfect for Hester. Her strength wasn't flamboyant innovation, but quiet refinement. Her spoons, teapots, and simple household pieces mirrored the new sensibility. Practical, modest, but dignified. What fascinates modern collectors, what makes her story soothing to tell at night, is how ordinary much of her work was. The Bateman hallmark can be found on teaspoons, sauce ladles, small buckles, and simple sugar tongs. Nothing screaming for attention. Just objects that slipped into daily life, polished and handled without fanfare. Imagine sipping tea in London around 1770, not realizing the sugar tongs in your hand were made by a widow who had stubbornly kept her family's workshop alive. That's history at its most invisibly powerful. Historians still argue whether she was aware of her growing reputation in those early decades. Was she deliberately building a brand, or simply surviving, piece by piece? The records are silent, but the sheer volume of her surviving work suggests she was more than a stopgap. She was steady. Steadiness, in the long run, built her name more surely than any grand innovation could. And that's what makes her place in London's silversmithing world so quietly radical. She didn't break rules dramatically. She bent them with patience. She didn't demand recognition. She earned it spoon by spoon. The city's silversmithing world was meant to be a stage for men. But by the 1760s, one widow was quietly writing her initials into its script. As you imagine her life unfolding, think of the hum of that workshop, the clank of a hammer, the scrape of a file, the faint smell of smoke. Outside, London was loud, chaotic, and restless. Inside, Hester's silver world was steady, repetitive, almost hypnotic-like, the kind of rhythm that nudges you toward sleep. The workshop became the heart of Hester's existence, not just as a place of work, but as the stage upon which her family's survival played out. When you picture it, think of a sprawling factory or a glittering showroom. Think instead of a narrow London house, where the front door opened straight onto a small street, and just behind it lay a space, half kitchen, half forge, cluttered with benches, tools, and scraps of metal. The Bateman household was the sort where family life and business life blurred completely. Children learned to walk between barrels of coal and heaps of filings. and every meal was punctuated by the ring of hammer on silver. Hester, as a widow, had little choice but to fold her family into the rhythm of the workshop. Her sons, Jonathan, Peter, and later William, would grow up with their hands on tools almost before they could write their names. Even her daughters, Letitia and Anne, became part of the operation, helping in smaller tasks like polishing, weighing, and keeping order. It was less a business and more a family survival plan. In a time before social safety nets, the workshop was the net. There's a mainstream historical fact worth lingering on here. 18th century apprenticeships were long and binding, usually 7 years under a master. Boys as young as 12 were indentured, living in their master's house, eating at his table, and working from dawn till dusk. For many families, it was the only way to learn a trade. But Hester's sons had no need to leave home for training. Her household doubled as their apprenticeship ground. Instead of sending them out to a master, she became the master herself, in all but name. That alone was a subtle bending of the usual rules. The daily work was repetitive, almost meditative. Molten silver was poured into ingots, hammered into sheets, then cut, shaped, and soldered into form. Spoons began as strips hammered flat, then bent and beaten into curves. Handles gradually thinned and refined. Teapots took weeks. Their rounded bodies formed from sheets, joined with delicate seams. Polishing was endless. Even the smallest teaspoon might pass through dozens of hands, each stage adding another layer of shine. It's easy to overlook the domestic alongside the technical, but that was the genius of the Bateman household. Hester blended the two. One moment she was directing an apprentice on filing down a rough edge. The next she was tending a simmering pot in the kitchen. Children recited lessons at the table, while their older brothers buffed silver near the fire. The line between school, home, and work was non-existent. Here is a quirky tidbit about workshops like hers. Coal smoke didn't just stain ceilings. It coated silver pieces in a fine, dark layer before they were polished. Some silversmiths joked that the first task of any apprentice was to learn how to clean soot off his own work before the master noticed. In the Bateman home, the smell of soot would have mingled with stew, bread, and ink, forming a scent so unique it probably clung to the children's clothes when they stepped outside. Historians still argue whether Hester herself took the hammer in hand for the heavy labor. Some believe she confined her efforts to management, bookkeeping, and the finishing touches. Others argue she must have been deeply hands-on, at least in the early years when the workshop was small. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Picture her overseeing an apprentice soldering a seam, then leaning in to adjust the flame herself. A widow in her 50s, sleeves rolled, her hair pinned tight, making sure the joint was neat enough to pass the guild's inspection. The family workshop also carried its share of noise-constant, metallic noise. Hammering, scraping, and polishing blended into a kind of steady drone. To visitors, it may have seemed overwhelming, but to the Batemans, it was the sound of survival. Silence would have been worse. Silence meant no orders, no work, and no food. In time, the children grew into their roles. Jonathan and Peter became adept at the bench, while William, the youngest, showed a knack for both design and business. The daughters, often invisible in records, almost certainly contributed as well. Household businesses relied on every pair of hands, regardless of gender, and through this web of family labor, Hester's initials, H.B., kept appearing at the assay office, stamped on spoons, tongs, and ladles. There's another historical fact that grounds this. Between 1761 and 1790, her mark was struck on thousands of pieces. Surviving examples today show remarkable consistency in quality. That wasn't luck. That was a mother-led team drilled into discipline. Imagine the quiet satisfaction she must have felt each time a finished set of teaspoons was bundled up, wrapped in paper, and carried off to the assay office. The workshop buzzing as though nothing remarkable had just happened. The family workshop wasn't glamorous. There were no portraits commissioned, no gilded salons to show off their wares, but its strength lay in rhythm. Silver came in, silver was shaped, silver went out. Children grew up, tools wore down, and life ticked forward with the steadiness of a hammer striking metal. And that steadiness, in its repetition, begins to lull, like the rhythmic tap of hammer on silver or the whisper of polishing cloth over a spoon's curve. The Bateman family workshop carried on day after day, turning survival into legacy without ever really intending to. If you settle deeper into the quiet rhythm of Hester's life, the next thing to notice is not the people but the craft itself. The delicate art of silver was more than just hitting metal until it looked right. It was a dance between science, patience, and a kind of humble artistry that didn't scream for attention but whispered in gleam and curve. To imagine Hester's world properly, you have to imagine the objects she spent her life surrounded by, have finished, cooling, stacked on benches, and waiting to be polished until they caught the candlelight like tiny mirrors. The process of silversmithing began with raw metal. Silver arrived in bars or ingots, heavy and dull in appearance, almost unremarkable. But in Hester's workshop, those ingots were transformed into sheets and wires. The hammering was steady, not violent, tap, 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 each strike stretching the metal thinner, wider, and smoother. An apprentice could spend hours hammering a single piece, and if his strikes were uneven, the surface would show ripples. Only a practiced hand could make a sheet so uniform that it seemed poured rather than beaten. From there, objects took shape. Teapots, for example, began as flat sheets cut into rounded petals. These were hammered over wooden forms, slowly coaxed into curves. The seams were joined with silver soda, a delicate process requiring just enough heat to melt the joint without warping the entire body. If you picture Hester leaning over a bench, the glow of the charcoal fire lighting her face, you might also imagine her sons standing nearby. One pumping the bellows to keep the coals alive, while another prepared the soda. There's a mainstream historical fact tucked here. London's silver was some of the most tightly regulated in Europe because of the assay system. Every piece above a set weight had to be sent to Goldsmiths' Hall, tested for purity, and marked with hallmarks showing the year, the city, and the maker. Without these, the item couldn't be sold legally. This meant Hester and her family were never working in isolation. Their silver constantly travelled to and from the assay office, joining a river of spoons, forks, and candlesticks made by dozens of other workshops. The Batemans were part of a much larger hum of production that made London glitter. But the artistry wasn't in the paperwork, it was in the details. Handles were engraved with patterns, often delicate scrolls or geometric borders. Sugar tongs might have tiny shell motifs, their curves balanced and pleasing to the hand. Even the plainest teaspoon had to be proportioned so that it sat well on the tongue and looked elegant on a table. Hester's hallmark became associated not with flamboyant design, but with solid, well-made pieces that ordinary households could trust. And then there was the polishing. If you've ever rubbed at a spoon until it shines, multiply that effort 100-fold. Silver resisted dullness, but also showed every scratch. Apprentices spent hours with cloth and pumice, smoothing every curve until the surface gleamed. Imagine Hester's daughters bent over a table, sleeves smudged with polish, turning each piece in the candlelight to check for flaws. It wasn't glamorous, but it was vital. A customer might forgive a plain design. They wouldn't forgive a dull or uneven shine. Here is a quirky tidbit. Some workshops used stale beer mixed with abrasives as a polishing solution. It was cheap, effective, and left behind a faint, yeasty smell. So alongside the scent of coal and metal, the Bateman home may have carried a faint aroma of sour beer clinging to silver that would later rest on genteel dining tables. Strange, but true. The art of silver was also the art of repetition. You didn't make one spoon, you made a dozen, or 50, each identical to the others. A customer expected consistency, and the Batemans delivered it. That kind of repetition demanded discipline. A single slip of the hammer or file could ruin a piece, wasting silver that was too precious to discard casually. In a family workshop, discipline wasn't just about quality, it was about survival. Historians still argue whether Hester herself designed patterns or relied on her sons for that creative side. Surviving examples of Bateman silver often feature restrained elegance, beaded edges, light engravings, simple classical motifs. The style fits neatly with Georgian taste of the 1770s and 1780s. Suggesting she or someone under her direction kept a keen eye on fashion without straying into extravagance. Some argue that her genius was not invention, but adaptation, always providing exactly what the market wanted without pushing too far. The rhythm of the workshop was like a slow heartbeat. Ingots melted, sheets hammered, forms shaped, seams soldered, surfaces polished, hallmarks struck. Again and again, like the cycles of a lullaby. For Hester, each object was both an end and a beginning. Sold today, replaced tomorrow, the flow never stopping. The delicate art of silver wasn't just about beauty. It was about endurance, patience, and a quiet hand steady enough to turn dull metal into something that glimmered softly in the candlelight of Georgian London. And as you picture her life framed by the shimmer of spoons and teapots, the sound of polishing cloth against metal might itself begin to feel like a lullaby, a repetitive hush that slows thought and softens the edges of wakefulness. If you were to lift one of Hester's spoons and turn it gently in the light, you would find more than just a gleam. You'd find a series of tiny, almost secretive stamps pressed into the metal marks that told a story in code. These weren't decorations. They were the backbone of London's silver trade. The invisible system that ensured quality and gave legitimacy to every object leaving a workshop. To understand Hester's world, you have to understand hallmarks, the quiet language of her craft. In 18th century London, every piece of silver above a certain weight had to make its way to the assay office at Goldsmiths Hall, a grand building not far from St. Paul's Cathedral. There, examiners tested the purity of the silver by literally scraping and filing samples. If the piece passed, it was struck with a sequence of marks. The lion passant, showing sterling silver quality, a letter representing the year, the leopard's head crowned, symbol of London, and finally, the maker's own registered mark. Without these, the item could not legally be sold. For Hester, this system was both a safeguard and a barrier. On one hand, it meant that her initials HB stood alongside the lion and leopard, giving her pieces the same legitimacy as those of any male silversmith. On the other hand, it also meant she had to present herself in an industry where women's names were rare, and whispers followed her work like shadows. A widow could register, yes, but she was expected to act as caretaker, not competitor. By pressing her HB mark year after year, Hester quietly subverted that expectation. There's a mainstream historical fact that highlights just how strict this world was. The lion passant mark, introduced centuries earlier, became one of the most trusted quality symbols in Europe. Buyers across the continent recognized it. A spoon with a lion passant wasn't just a spoon. It was a guarantee that it contained at least 92.5% pure silver. This made London's silver trade powerful and made hallmarks the most important detail of any object. Hester's mark itself was simple. HB in a rectangle with clipped corners. Not ornate, not fancy, just clear. Over the decades, she registered variations, adapting to new rules about shape and format. Each registration was a small declaration of persistence, proof that she wasn't simply filling a temporary role, she was here to stay. Collectors today trace her entire career through these stamps, like footprints left in metal. One quirky tidbit: counterfeit marks were a real problem. Some shady silversmiths tried to fake hallmarks, punching them into substandard silver or even into silver-plated items. The assay office punished this harshly, sometimes parading offenders publicly. For someone like Hester, the risk of being accused of malpractice, whether deserved or not, would have been terrifying. So her workshop stayed scrupulously careful. Better to lose a little silver to overfiling than to risk rejection at Goldsmiths Hall. Historians still argue whether Hester's hallmark gave her an edge in attracting customers. Some suggest that her reputation as a widow, working honestly and steadily, made buyers sympathetic, even loyal. Others argue that most customers didn't care who made their spoons, as long as the hallmark was there. In either case, her initials became part of London's vast silver language, repeated so often that, by sheer accumulation, they became familiar. The act of striking a hallmark was both violent and delicate. A tiny steel punch, engraved with the mark, was placed against the silver. A single blow from a hammer imprinted it permanently. To light, and the mark was faint, too heavy, and the piece could warp. Imagine one of her sons holding a teaspoon on a steel block, steadying his breath, and then striking the punch just right, leaving the letters HB deep enough to last for centuries. That moment, repeated thousands of times, is why her legacy still rests in museums and collections today. And what a strange contrast it was. On the surface, her life seemed ordinary. Meals cooked, laundry done, children raised. Yet, in the workshop, she was creating objects stamped with symbols that would outlive her. Each hallmark was like a whisper forward in time. I was here, I worked, I endured. She may not have thought of it in those terms, but centuries later, the coded marks tell her story more clearly than any diary could. The world of hallmarks was a world of both secrecy and trust. To the untrained eye, they looked like tiny scratches. To merchants, they were contracts. To historians, they're breadcrumbs across time. And to Hester, they were survival, the small proof that her work belonged in the marketplace of London, no less valid than the men around her. As you let this image settle, picture a tray of freshly polished spoons, lined neatly, each stamped with its sequence of marks, waiting to be wrapped and carried to market. The shine catches the candlelight, the hallmarks glint like stars in miniature, and the steady rhythm of her household carries on another day. Another set, another small code, pressed quietly into history. The story of Hester Bateman is often told through her silver and her hallmark. But to imagine her life fully, you have to see her not only as a widow or a silversmith, but as a mother at the bench, someone whose family was stitched directly into the fabric of her trade. Picture the workshop not as a sterile space of artisanship, but as a lived-in home, where meals, quarrels, lessons, and work overlapped in a blur. Children grew up alongside spoons and teapots, and the rhythms of silver making were the rhythms of family life. Hester had 5 children: Jonathan, Peter, William, Letitia, and Anne. Each one, in some way, became part of her enterprise. Jonathan and Peter were the first to join her formally at the bench. They filed, hammered, and polished under her direction, learning the trade that had sustained the family since before their father's death. William, the youngest son, came of age later, but proved both talented and ambitious, eventually carrying the family name further into London's silver world. The daughters, while less visible in records, almost certainly took on polishing, bookkeeping, and household duties. A family business in the 18th century rarely spared anyone from labor. Mainstream historical fact. In Georgian London, it was common for children to work alongside parents. Child labor wasn't seen as unusual or cruel. It was survival. A boy might begin filing or polishing silver at age 10. A girl might help weigh metal or clean tools before she could sew. In Hester's workshop, family and labor were inseparable. not by design, but by necessity. Imagine a typical day. The morning might begin with the sharp clatter of tools, as Jonathan and Peter took up their hammers. Hester, moving between benches, checked the work, offered corrections, and perhaps paused to stir a pot on the hearth. Letitia and Anne polished spoons at a small table, their cloths blackened with soot and residue. William, younger at the time, might have been sweeping filings from the floor precious scraps that could be melted and reused. Every ounce of silver mattered, and not a speck was wasted. Here is a quirky tidbit. Filings swept from workshop floors were often collected and burned with scrap wood, the ashes sifted for tiny flecks of silver. Some families even shook their clothes and swept their shoes carefully, knowing dust itself could contain valuable fragments. It's not impossible that Hester, ever careful, oversaw such recovery, ensuring that her household lost nothing that could be reclaimed. The blending of family life and trade wasn't without strain. Imagine the noise. Hammers striking, files rasping, bellows blowing at the forge, children chattering or quarreling in the background. Meals were eaten quickly, often with soot still on hands and faces. Polishing cloths and laundry likely shared the same wash basin. The smell of stew simmering over coals mingled with the tang of molten solder. For the Batemans, there was no separation of spheres. The home was the workshop. The workshop was the home. Historians still argue whether this fusion of family and trade gave Hester's children an advantage, or bound them too tightly to the forge. Some see the Bateman sons as fortunate, inheriting skills and a thriving enterprise. Others suggest they had little choice, pressed into labor by necessity. What's undeniable is that the family workshop became their world, shaping not only their careers but their identities. And yet, there was tenderness hidden in the noise. Imagine Hester guiding William's small hands as he learned to steady a spoon for polishing. Picture her pausing to correct Jonathan's hammer strokes, her tone firm but patient. Picture the daughters, Letitia and Anne, giggling softly as they polished sugar tongs, the shine slowly emerging under their cloths. These small domestic moments, folded into the clang and scrape of silver, are where Hester's life truly unfolded, not in the grand markets or halls of London, but in the quiet persistence of family together at work. One mainstream fact fits beautifully here. By the 1770s, tea drinking had become nearly universal in Britain, and the demand for silver teaspoons exploded. Imagine the Bateman children filing and polishing hundreds of tiny spoons, each destined for tables across London. A single family's steady work helped feed a national craze. Each spoon sold meant food on their table, clothes on their backs, and the endurance of their household. The mother at the bench image is more than symbolic. It captures the essence of Hester's role, not just a widow filling a gap, but a matriarch weaving her children into a shared enterprise. She wasn't simply managing silver. She was managing lives, ensuring that every strike of the hammer and every stroke of the polishing cloth carried the family one step further from poverty. As you drift deeper into her story, think of the scene. A dimly lit room, fire glowing, tools scattered, children bent to their tasks. At the center, a woman in plain dress, sleeves rolled, moving between bench and hearth with calm persistence. The silver glimmers faintly under candlelight, not yet finished, not yet perfect, but steady in its making, like the family itself. And that image, repeated across years, becomes a rhythm almost musical. The clang of hammers, the scrape of files, the hush of cloth on silver. A lullaby of labor, binding family to craft, and carrying them quietly but surely into history. The silver objects themselves tell a quieter story than any diary might. To really understand Hester Bateman's life, you need to imagine the patterns of Georgian tastes, the designs, the trends, and the fashions that shaped what came out of her workshop day after day. Because silver wasn't just practical, it was a reflection of social ambition. A spoon could be a status symbol, a teapot a statement, a candlestick a declaration that the household had arrived at a certain level of refinement. By the mid-18th century, Britain was firmly in its Georgian era, named for the kings George I through George IV. The style of the time was elegant but restrained, a departure from the swirling excess of Baroque. Instead of heavy ornamentation, there was a preference for clean lines, balance, and motifs borrowed from classical antiquity. Think beaded edges, laurel wreaths, and subtle fluting, simple, symmetrical, dignified. This was perfect ground for Hester's steady hand and pragmatic approach. Mainstream historical fact: the neoclassical style took hold in Britain around the 1760s, influenced by archaeological discoveries at Pompeii and Herculaneum. Suddenly, everyone wanted their dining rooms to echo ancient Rome or Greece. Even silverware followed suit. Handles featured urn motifs, borders resembled temple friezes, and tea sets looked as if they belonged in a Roman villa. It was less about originality and more about echoing the tastes of the learned and fashionable. Hester's workshop embraced these patterns without chasing extremes. Many of her pieces feature delicate, beaded borders, tiny dots, stamped or chased into the edge of spoons, ladles, or teapots. The beading caught light beautifully, giving even plain objects a sense of refinement. It's a detail so small that it's easy to miss, but repeated across a set of teaspoons, it becomes quietly elegant, almost hypnotic. Here's a quirky tidbit. While silver was prized for its gleam, it tarnished quickly. Owners had to polish it constantly to maintain that bright look. In fact, silver polishing became such a chore that some households hired servants specifically for it. Imagine the irony. Genteel families buying Bateman silver for its understated dignity, only to set a servant scrubbing away day after day, while the pieces dulled again overnight. Hester's customers weren't just buying utensils. They were buying into a cycle of endless maintenance. Historians still argue whether Hester herself had an eye for design or whether her sons steered the stylistic direction of the workshop. Some believe that she, being practical and cautious, kept designs simple to appeal to the widest market. Others argue that William, her youngest son, later injected more flair, pushing the firm toward fashionable neoclassicism. Either way, the Bateman hallmark became synonymous with silver, that matched the taste of the day without ever being ostentatious. Take, for example, her sugar tongs. These were small, everyday objects jewels for lifting sugar cubes into teapot. Under Hester's hallmark, they carried a certain grace. Smooth arms, symmetrical curves, sometimes decorated with light engraving or beading. Nothing excessive, but refined enough to show guests that the household wasn't merely scraping by. Multiply that across hundreds of households, and you see how her steady work helped shape the visual texture of Georgian tea culture. It's worth pausing here to think about how these patterns reached her. Design books circulated in London, with engravings of the latest styles from Paris, Rome, or fashionable architects like Robert Adam. Silversmiths studied them, adapted them, and folded their motifs into everyday items. Hester's workshop may well have had a few of these books tucked away, their pages thumbed by her sons as they worked on new commissions. Inspiration filtered from high art down into teaspoons. The truth is, much of her success came not from dazzling invention, but from giving customers exactly what they wanted. Pieces that looked fashionable without being extravagant. Her silver slipped seamlessly into dining rooms and parlors, neither screaming for attention nor lagging behind the times. That balance between modesty and elegance was her workshop's signature. And while today collectors marvel at Bateman silver as antiques, in her lifetime these objects were tools of daily life. A spoon was stirred in tea. A teapot was carried across tables. Candlesticks lit family dinners. They weren't museum pieces. They were companions of ordinary rituals. Yet, through those ordinary patterns, her initials endured. As you picture these objects, spoons with tiny beaded edges, tongs with graceful curves, teapots with restrained classical shapes, let them gleam faintly in your mind's eye. They sit on Georgian tables, catching candlelight, reflecting faces long forgotten. Each one whispers the patterns of its age, and each one carries the silent touch of a widow's household workshop, steady in its craft. And in the repetition of these designs, dot after dot in a beaded border, curve after curve in a handle, the patterns become almost hypnotic, like the rhythmic stitching of embroidery or the steady rocking of a cradle. You can almost feel your thoughts smoothing out like the silver itself, polished again and again until it gleams softly in the dim. By now, you've seen how Hester's silver blended seamlessly with the tastes of Georgian England. But what you Haven Tea yet felt is the constant undertow pulling at her, because she wasn't tea just making silver. She was doing so in a man's world. For a woman to keep a business afloat, to hire apprentices, to stamp her initials into metal, was not simply unusual. It was quietly radical. And it came with challenges she couldn't polish away as icily as tarnish. Let us start with the basic reality. 18th century London was a society where gender roles were thickly drawn. Men worked trades, held property, and appeared in guild records. Women married, managed households, and raised children. Yes, widows had certain rights, but those rights were understood as temporary cushions, meant to hold them until they remarried or until sons took over. A widow was not expected to dig her heels in and run a thriving business for decades. Hester did exactly that. Mainstream historical fact. In 18th century London, widows could register makers' marks in the silversmithing trade, but the majority either closed shop within a few years or passed the trade quickly to their sons. Very few ran businesses of lasting reputation. Hester's registration in 1761 wasn't unusual. Her continued presence, year after year, was extraordinary. Imagine the whispers she must have endured at Goldsmiths' Hall. When she appeared to register her hallmark, the clerks would have seen her name again and again, outlasting some of the men who had scoffed at her. Customers may have raised eyebrows, some perhaps reluctant to buy silver made by a woman. Apprentices could have resisted her authority, doubting whether her direction carried the weight of a master. Every day brought quiet tests of legitimacy, and yet she endured. Her answer wasn't confrontation, but consistency. Each time a spoon passed the assay, each time her initials came back approved, she answered without words. The work speaks for itself. Here is a quirky tidbit. Georgian newspapers occasionally mocked women who strayed too far into men's roles, describing them as mannish or unladylike, but Hester seems to have escaped caricature. Perhaps her plain, modest designs and her avoidance of flamboyance kept her under the radar. While other women drew satire, she drew respecter, at least tolerance. Historians still argue whether she faced deliberate obstruction from her male peers. Some suggest she carved out a small, modest niche that men didn't bother to contest. Others argue that her sheer productivity, thousands of marked pieces, meant she was competing directly with established firms, forcing them to acknowledge her. The debate lingers because records are sparse, and Hester herself left no diary. Her silver is her only voice, and it whispers persistence rather than protest. Consider the balancing act she lived daily. On one hand, she was the matriarch of a family, running a household, feeding children, keeping order. On the other hand, she was the head of a workshop, directing apprentices, meeting with merchants, and producing goods for one of the most competitive markets in Europe. Few men of her time could claim to juggle both roles. Yet she did so quietly, without grand speeches or public displays. The very ordinariness of her survival made it revolutionary. She didn't march, she didn't lecture, she didn't demand recognition. She simply lived in defiance of the boundaries around her, letting the shine of her silver do the talking. And that silver, stamped with HBN, entered homes that may never have known nor cared that a woman's hand had directed its making. Picture a genteel London hostess lifting a Bateman sugar tongue in front of her guests. She boasts of her fine silver, never realizing she's holding the product of a widow's defiance. That Hester's quiet victory to infiltrate society's tables without anyone noticing the radicalism hidden in plain sight. It's almost poetic. The challenges she faced as a woman were never overcome through grand gestures, but through the steady polish of repetition. Her initials became familiar not because she shouted, but because she endured. And in that endurance, she carved her place in a man's world. Not by force, but by patience. Now, Imagine her at the bench, again hairpinned, sleeves rolled, eyes steady. Around her, the clang of hammers and the scrape of files. Outside, London bustles, men in wigs striding into guild halls, women in wide skirts crowding markets. Inside, a widow works quietly, her initials pressed into history, her presence felt not in noise but in gleam. And as that image settles, you may feel the same steady persistence, the hum of defiance disguised as routine. The kind of rhythm that slows your breath and makes the world feel a little softer, a little quieter, as sleep drifts closer. If you close your eyes for a moment, you can almost hear the steady rhythm of Hester's life. Not dramatic highs and lows, but the quiet repetition of commissions, small jobs, steady orders, and the kind of work that filled a workshop with purpose. The Bateman household didn't thrive on grand masterpieces meant for palaces. It thrived on the endless cycle of everyday silver, and it was precisely this cycle that made her business stable, dependable, and enduring. Think of what a commission meant in 18th century London. A merchant might order a dozen teaspoons for resale in his shop. A clergyman might commission a new chalice or set of patens for his parish. A middling household might scrape together enough money for a pair of candlesticks to mark a wedding or christening. None of these jobs made headlines, but each one mattered, both to the customer and to the Bateman family. It was the accumulation of the small that sustained them. Mainstream historical fact. Parish churches across London and beyond often ordered communion silver from modest workshops like Hester. It was less expensive than buying from the most fashionable firms, but still reliable, thanks to the hallmark system. This meant that even rural congregations might have handled Bateman silver during Sunday service, without ever knowing the story of the widow who produced it. Imagine one such order. A simple flagon for holding wine. The workshop prepared sheets, hammered them into curves, joined the seams, added a handle, and polished until the surface gleamed. The piece was stamped, carried to Goldsmiths' Hall, and then sent off to a parish, perhaps miles away. The congregation would lift it each week, never imagining the family life and domestic chaos that had birthed it. That's the beauty of Hester's commissions. They slipped quietly into the lives of strangers, almost invisible, yet deeply woven into daily rituals. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Georgian households considered silver so valuable that they recorded every spoon in their wills, item by item. A teaspoon wasn't just an object. It was an heirloom, a piece of family identity. Imagine a Bateman teaspoon passed down 3 generations, eventually turning up at an estate sale centuries later. What began as a routine commission became a link in someone's family chain. For Hester, the rhythm of commissions also shaped the rhythm of her household. The workshop couldn't afford downtime. When one order finished, another began. Apprentices polished until their fingers cramped. Children filed until their shoulders ached. And Hester kept the books, checked the work, and managed the flow. A tray of sugar tongs one week, a batch of buckles the next, a small run of ladles after that. No piece was glamorous on its own, but together they built a foundation strong enough to last decades. Historians still argue whether Hester ever secured truly elite clients, noble households, aristocratic commissions. Surviving records don't confirm it, but given the sheer output of her workshop, it's possible that her work graced tables in grand homes as well as modest kitchens. Yet the bulk of her business was clearly middle market, and that was precisely her strength. By catering to the steady hum of ordinary commissions, she avoided the feast or famine cycles that plagued more flamboyant workshops. Picture the family at work on a typical commission for teaspoons. Sheets of silver cut into strips, hammered into shallow bowls, bent into gentle curves. Each handle filed smooth, each edge polished bright. Dozens of near-identical spoons lined up in rows, waiting to be hooked. The repetition might sound dull, but for the Batemans it was reassurance. Each spoon finished meant another coin in the family purse, another day of survival secured. There's something soothing about the sheer predictability of it. Orders came, silver was shaped, orders left. The workshop never rested, but it also never lurched into chaos. Hester had built a rhythm that carried her family forward, steady as the ticking of a clock. And so, in the commissions that kept arriving, whether chalices for churches, teaspoons for tea drinkers, or candlesticks for weddings, you can hear the pulse of her life. Not grand, not loud, but steady. A pulse hammered into silver, polished into gleam, and stamped with the initials HB. Let that image sink in. Trays of finished work lined neatly. Candlelight glinting on polished surfaces, the family moving quietly from one order to the next. The rhythm doesn't demand attention. It lulls like waves breaking gently on a shore. And in that rhythm you may find your own breath slowing, your thoughts softening, carried along by the commissions of a widow who found her survival in the steady hum of silver. By the time Hester's household workshop was running smoothly, it had transformed from a fragile widow's gamble into something sturdier, a family enterprise. What began as Hester keeping her late husband's trade alive became, over the decades, a business involving multiple children, apprentices, and a reputation that stretched across London. It wasn't dramatic growth, no sudden explosion of wealth or prestige, but a gradual strengthening. Spoon by spoon, commission by commission. And in that quiet persistence, the Batemans created a dynasty of sorts. Mainstream historical fact: many Georgian craft workshops passed through a single generation before fading. Skills were lost, businesses closed, and names forgotten. The Bateman family stands out precisely because it endured. Hester's sons, particularly Peter and Jonathan, stepped firmly into the trade, registering marks of their own under her guidance. Later, her youngest, William, would not only join, but expand the family's reach. The workshop outlived her, stretching into the 19th century, a rare continuity in an industry where most names flickered briefly before vanishing. Picture the workshop in its busiest years. Jonathan at one bench, carefully hammering a ladle into shape. Peter checking a seam on a teapot, the glow of coals reflecting in his eyes. William, still younger, sketching designs on scrap paper or filing a handle into graceful symmetry. Hester, at the center, moving between them, checking work, calculating weights, keeping accounts. The daughters, Letitia and Anne, likely managing polishing and household tasks, ensuring the endless cycle of production never faltered. Apprentices came and went, folded into the family rhythm, learning their trade under the widow's watchful eye. Here, a quirky tidbit. Family-run silver workshops often pass down not just tools, but recipes, mixtures for polishing solutions, tricks for soldering, shortcuts for shaping. Some families guarded these secrets fiercely, handing them only to blood relatives. Imagine Hester passing along not just the hammer and files, but also quiet instructions on how to get a better shine with less effort, or how to coax a tricky seam closed. These weren't recorded in books. They were whispered at benches, preserved in memory. Historians still argue whether Hester deliberately envisioned the Bateman firm as a family dynasty or whether she simply kept the business afloat long enough for her sons to take over naturally. Some see her as a strategic matriarch, planning for continuity. Others argue she was pragmatic, thinking only of survival day by day. The Batemans produced larger set ladles, serving spoons, teapots, and candlestick pieces that required more skill and carried higher value. Orders overlapped, deadlines pressed, and the household buzzed with overlapping tasks. Imagine the sight of dozens of pieces at once, lined on benches in various stages of completion. Some half-shaped, others cooling, others gleaming with final polish. At the heart of it all was Hester, now older, still steady. Her hands may have grown stiff, her hair silvered, but her authority carried through. Apprentices obeyed, sons consulted, and her initials HB continued to appear on work passing through the assay office. The transition from widow's workshop to family firm wasn't a single moment. It was gradual, like dawn creeping across rooftops. One year, Jonathan registered his mark alongside hers. Another year, Peter did the same. Later, William's energy pushed the enterprise further. Piece by piece, they expanded the scale while keeping the character of their mother's work. Reliable, restrained, quietly elegant. There's something soothing about the idea of continuity. The same benches, the same tools, the same rhythmic hammering that had carried the family through widowhood now carried them into legacy. Each generation added its touch, but the heartbeat of the workshop remained steady. And for you, listening now, it is easy to let that image blur into something like a dream. A family bound together by silver. Their days marked not by drama, but by repetition. The clang of hammers, the hiss of solder, the scrape of files all overlapping with the chatter of children, the warmth of a hearth, the murmur of shared meals. A household that was a workshop, and a workshop that was a household. The Batemans didn't just survive, they grew. Quietly, steadily, without spectacle. And in that growth lies the kind of story that lulls, rather than excites, a rhythm of persistence, carrying forward on the shine of silver that bore their name. When you think of Hester Bateman's silver today, it sits behind glass, in museums, or gleams on the velvet displays of antique dealers. But, in her own time, those objects didn't live in silence. They passed constantly from hand to hand, moving through the messy network of clients and connections that kept her workshop alive. Hester wasn't only a mother at the bench or a manager of apprentices. She was also, quietly, a businesswoman who had to cultivate trust, strike bargains, and build relationships in a London buzzing with trade. Mainstream historical fact. London in the late 18th century was a hub of silver retailing, with dozens of small shops scattered across districts like Cheapside and Fleet Street. Silversmiths didn't always sell directly to the final customer. Instead, they worked through merchants, retailers, or wholesalers who stocked their goods. For Hester, this meant that many of her clients were shopkeepers who ordered sets of spoons, tongs, or candlesticks to sell on. She didn't always know where her silver ended up, but she knew who kept ordering it. Picture one of these transactions. A shopkeeper visits her modest workshop, examines a row of polished teaspoons lined neatly on a cloth, weighs them carefully in his hands, and nods in approval. He agrees to take a dozen, perhaps more, carrying them off to his storefront, where genteel customers will handle them, never asking the name of the widow who oversaw their making. That was the nature of her business, anonymous in the marketplace, yet indispensable in supply. But she also had private customers. A young couple marrying might order a small set of candlesticks as a wedding gift. A family celebrating a christening might commission a christening spoon, engraved with initials. A parish might pool funds for communion silver. Each client, large or small, was woven into the Bateman family's survival. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Georgian customers treated silversmiths like early interior designers, expecting advice not only on the objects themselves, but on how they would match the look of their tables and rooms. Imagine Hester, sleeves rolled, suggesting to a merchant that a beaded border on a teapot would harmonize with the candlesticks already in fashion. She wasn't just selling, she was shaping taste in subtle ways. Historians still argue whether Hester herself negotiated directly with clients or whether her sons gradually took on that role. Some accounts suggest she kept a firm hand on business well into old age, while others picture her stepping back as the boys grew confident. Either way, the Bateman hallmark's survival shows that clients trusted her workshop enough to keep returning. Consistency, more than charisma, was her strongest connection. The gentry wealthy but not noble families were an important tier of her clientele. They wanted silver that looked fashionable but didn't break the bank. Bateman silver fit perfectly. Well-made, elegant, but not ostentatious. Imagine a dinner party in a townhouse. Candlelight reflecting off Bateman teaspoons laid neatly beside china cups. Guests admire the refinement, never guessing that the initials HB at the bottom of the handle belonged to a widow S workshop tucked away in a quieter street. For church commissions, the connection carried an extra weight. Communion silver was sacred in purpose, but ordinary in making. Hester's workshop likely produced chalices, patens, and flagons that passed from hand to hand in Sunday services, linking her labor to the spiritual rhythms of communities she never visited. Her initials, small and discreet, sat on objects that became part of weekly rituals of faith. The flow of clients and connections wasn't always smooth. Payments might be late, silver might be returned for small flaws, and competition was fierce. But Hester's reputation for reliability kept orders coming. Her hallmark became shorthand for trustworthiness. Not the most daring designs, perhaps, but always solid, always pure, always polished. It's strangely comforting to imagine her clients moving in and out of that workshop, their conversations overlapping with the clang of hammers and the hiss of coals. The family continues their work in the background, while Hester or one of her sons measures silver on a scale, notes the figures in a ledger, and agrees to terms. A handshake, a nod, a package wrapped, and the cycle continues. Connections like these didn't just keep her business alive. They wove her into the fabric of London itself. Without grand speeches, without headlines, she became part of the city's daily economy. Her initials passing quietly through shops, parlors, and churches. And as you picture that network of clients and connections, merchants, gentry, clergy, households, you can feel the web of her world expanding outward, each commission another thread. The threads don't shout, they hum. They form a net strong enough to hold her family steady, like the soft mesh of sleep slowly wrapping around you now. Step outside the Bateman household for a moment, and you'll find yourself in the city that framed Hester's life. London, in the second half of the 18th century. To understand her world, it isn't enough to picture polished spoons and neat hallmarks. You need to feel the streets beneath your feet, smell the air, and hear the constant rumble that never truly quieted, because her silver, after all, didn't exist in a vacuum. It existed in a city, alive with noise, grit, and contradiction. Mainstream historical fact. London, around 1770, was the largest city in Europe, with nearly 750,000 people. It was the hub of trade for an empire stretching across oceans. Ships docked at the Thames, carrying sugar, tea, tobacco, and spices, luxuries that transformed daily life and fueled the very demand for silver teapots, sugar tongs, and spoons. Without that empire, Hester's workshop would have had far fewer commissions. Every teaspoon polished in her home was part of a global web that reached as far as the West Indies and China. But the grandeur of empire didn't erase the grime of the city itself. Imagine walking along her neighborhood streets, narrow lanes crowded with carts, the cobbles slick with rain or mud, depending on the season. The air was thick with smoke from thousands of chimneys, mixing with the sharper smells of tanneries, breweries, and horse dung. Street hawkers called out, endlessly selling pies, fresh fish, ribbons, even pins. Children darted between legs, dogs barked, and somewhere nearby a bell chimed the hour. Here is a quirky tidbit. Londoners of the time often complained about the city's smell, describing it as a mix of rotten eggs and soot. Some even believed the stench caused illness, and a few doctors recommended carrying scented handkerchiefs dipped in vinegar to ward off bad air. Imagine Hester stepping out briefly from her workshop, pulling her shawl closer against the fog, catching whiffs of coal and sewage as she made her way to Goldsmiths' Hall with a batch of finished work. The city was divided between wealth and poverty in ways you couldn't miss. Carriages carrying ladies in silks rolled past barefoot children begging in the streets. Grand townhouses stood not far from crowded tenements where families crammed into single rooms. For a widow like Hester, the line between respectability and poverty was thin. Her workshop kept her on the respectable side, but the shadow of hardship was never far away. Historians still argue whether her household was considered prosperous or modest by the standards of her day. Some point to the sheer volume of Bateman silver surviving as evidence of success. Others caution that volume didn't necessarily equal wealth, that her family may have worked constantly just to stay afloat in a city where prices for coal, food, and rent were always rising. Markets were the heartbeat of London, and Hester would have relied on them often. Smithfield bustled with livestock, Covent Garden with vegetables and flowers, Cheapside with textiles and small goods. Each trip was noisy and chaotic, but also essential. Picture her sons haggling for supplies, her daughters carrying baskets, the family weaving through crowds under the watchful eyes of pickpockets. And then there was the river. The Thames was both lifeline and hazard. Barges carried goods in and out, while the river's surface often shimmered with oil, waste, and debris. Yet it was the artery of the city, the reason London thrived at all. Without the river's traffic, there would have been no tea, no sugar, and therefore no need for all those Bateman spoons and sugar tongs. The city beyond the workshop also shaped the rhythm of time. Sundays meant church bells and quieter streets. Market days brought chaos and noise. Holidays, like Michaelmas or Christmas, filled the air with festivities, street performances, and vendors selling roasted chestnuts. Hester's family likely balanced work with these rhythms, pausing briefly for celebration before returning to the steady hum of silver. And in the evenings, when shutters closed and lamps flickered, London didn't sleep so much as murmur. Night watchmen patrolled with rattles and lanterns, calling the hour. The clatter of late-night carriages echoed down lanes. From taverns came the sounds of songs and drunken laughter. In her modest home, the Bateman family might have sat down to a simple supper, the workshop tools cooling, the day's labour resting in tidy stacks. London was not gentle, but it was alive. And for Hester, it was the stage on which her quiet survival played out. The city's energy flowed into her workshop, shaping the demand for silver, testing her resilience, and surrounding her with a constant, restless hum. As you picture it, the smoke, the bells, the markets, the rivulet, those sounds and smells blur into something softer. The noise of London becomes a distant murmur, the kind that fades into the background until it feels less like chaos, and more like the low hum of a fan in a darkened room. The city that bustled around Hester now becomes the lull that carries you further into rest. By the later years of her career, something remarkable had happened almost without anyone noticing. Hester Bateman, once just a widow clinging to survival, had gained recognition. Not the kind of recognition that makes headlines or stirs gossip at court. but the quieter kind that really mattered. Her hallmark had become a sign of reliability. Customers who wanted silver they could trust, elegant but not extravagant, began to seek out the Bateman name. Her initials, HB, had shifted from anonymity into something like a brand. Mainstream historical fact. By the 1780s, the London silver trade was so crowded that hundreds of silversmiths were registered at Goldsmiths' Hall. Amid this sea of initials and marks, only a few names became widely known. The Batemans were among them. Collectors today can easily identify her work, and it appears in major museum collections. From the Victoria and Albert Museum in London to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, that recognition began in her own lifetime, when merchants realized that Bateman silver meant well-crafted, fashionable, and dependable. Imagine a shopkeeper explaining to a customer in 1785, "These spoons are Bateman, solid, fine, and quite in taste." The buyer might not know who Hester was, but the name carried weight. And in a world where reputation was everything, that was no small achievement. Here is a quirky tidbit. Some customers developed such loyalty to particular makers that they would refuse to buy silver without their preferred hallmark. For households that had already invested in Bateman teaspoons or sugar tongs, adding more pieces with the same initials meant matching sets a status symbol in Georgian dining. So, in a way, Hester had created not just objects but customer loyalty, a rare feat in her era. Historians still argue whether Hester herself ever realized how firmly her reputation had spread. Did she take quiet pride each time she saw her hallmark in a shop window? Or did she remain too focused on daily work balancing ledgers, directing apprentices, tending to household needs to stop and reflect? The evidence doesn't give us her thoughts, but the sheer volume of Bateman silver that survives suggests her recognition was widespread, if understated. Recognition came, too, in the form of her sons stepping forward. Jonathan and Peter registered their marks, extending the family's presence. Later, William added his energy and ambition, making Bateman silver even more prominent. Yet, even as her children's names appeared alongside hers, the initials HB never faded. The widow's mark continued to stand on its own. By the late 1780s, collectors note a refinement in Bateman designs, more classical motifs, more ambitious forms. Teapots with graceful curves, candlesticks with clean lines, ladles with elegant proportions. These were not the plain survival pieces of her earliest years. They were confident, stylish, and fully in step with Georgian taste. The workshop had grown from a widow's lifeline into a respected firm. It's worth remembering that recognition didn't mean glamour. Hester wasn't suddenly dining with dukes or gracing society pages. Her life likely remained much the same. A modest home, a busy workshop, long days, steady labor. The recognition lived in the silver itself, in the way her hallmark carried weight among buyers. Quiet recognition, not noisy fame, and that, in its own way, is more soothing. It's not the story of triumph through spectacle, but triumph through steadiness. A spoon polished, a hallmark struck, a customer satisfied. Again and again, until the initials became familiar, trusted, respected. Picture her in those years, older now, hair lined with grey, her presence still steady in the workshop. Apprentices come and go, sons take more of the heavy labour, daughters tend to polishing and household tasks. Hester moves more slowly perhaps, but her eye remains sharp, a seam out of place, a polish unfinished, a hallmark struck too faint she notices, corrects, and ensures the standard never slips. Recognition wasn't given lightly in London's silver world. It was earned in precisely this way, through relentless attention to detail, year after year. As you imagine those later years, let the image soften. Trays of finished silver, neatly stacked, catching candlelight. The initials HB glowing faintly in tiny rectangles. Customers quietly asking for Bateman pieces in shops across London. Recognition has come, not with noise, but with the hush of respect earned slowly, and that hush the sound of a name carried forward, not by shouting, but by repetition, becomes almost like a lullaby in itself. A rhythm of trust that calms the mind, just as her silver once calmed the flicker of candlelight on Georgian tables. By the time the 1790s arrived, Hester Bateman had lived a long life at the bench. She had raised children into adulthood, overseen countless commissions, and seen her initials struck into thousands of silver pieces that now scattered across London's parlours, churches, and shops. But age, as it does, crept into her bones. Her role began to shift, not an abrupt retirement, but a gradual retreat, as her children and apprentices took on more of the daily labour while she guided from the background. Mainstream historical fact: Hester Bateman officially retired from active work in 1790, around the age of 82. By then, her sons Peter, Jonathan, and William had all established themselves in the family trade, and her daughters Letitia and Anne were likely settled into household roles. The firm, however, continued. The Bateman name didn't fade with her retirement. Instead, it grew stronger, carried by the next generation. Picture her twilight years. She no longer leaned over the bench with hammer in hand, but she still walked the workshop floor. Her sons consulted her on designs, her grandsons began to appear at the edges of the trade, and the apprentices, perhaps not even aware of her full legacy, worked under the quiet authority of a woman who had once carried the entire enterprise on her shoulders. Even if her hands shook, her eye remained sharp. A seam slightly off, a polish unfinished she would have noticed, her voice still steady in correction. Here's a quirky tidbit. Many older silversmiths, men and women alike, kept broken or worn tools as keepsakes, their handles smoothed by decades of work. It's tempting to imagine Hester keeping an old hammer, its wooden handle darkened with age, as a kind of companion in her later years. Tools become extensions of the body, and after so many decades, it would have been impossible for her to look at one without remembering the life it had sustained. Historians still argue whether she lived out her final years in comfort or in modest restraint. Some point to the success of her sons and the endurance of the firm as evidence that she enjoyed relative stability. Others suggest that, Even with recognition, silversmithing was never wildly profitable, and her twilight years were simple rather than grand. What seems certain is that she remained surrounded by family, the heart of the enterprise she had built. Imagine her evenings in those years. The workshop quieted earlier now, her sons carrying the weight of commissions. Candles burned lower, meals were simpler, and conversations circled around family news rather than immediate survival. She might have sat near the hearth, silver objects cooling on benches nearby, the hum of the city faint beyond the walls. Her grandchildren tugged at her sleeves, unaware that the woman beside them was one of the most remarkable silversmiths of her age. There's comfort in the thought that her twilight wasn't lonely. Many widows of her time fell into obscurity, their households dissolved, their names forgotten. Hester, instead, became the matriarch of a thriving family firm. Her presence still felt in every commission that left the workshop. Her initials may have retired, but her legacy was stamped deeply into the habits of her children and the shine of their work. In those twilight years, the silver itself must have taken on new meaning. She could look at a tray of teaspoons and see not just objects for sale, but proof of decades of endurance. Each hallmark struck was another reminder that she had survived widowhood, raised children, and left them with more than survival. She had left them with a trade, a reputation, and a future. And as you picture her in that stage of life, older, slower, quieter, you may find the rhythm of her twilight years soothing. No longer the frantic hammering of survival, but the softer hum of continuity. The silver still gleamed, but the pressure was eased. Her legacy was safe in her children's hands. Let that image settle. A widow who began with almost nothing, who endured against expectation, now resting in the twilight of her years. Her story carried forward in every gleam of silver that bore the Bateman name. By the closing years of the 18th century, the hum of Hester Bateman's workshop had slowed for her personally, but it had not gone silent. Her sons, her daughters, and soon even her grandchildren had taken up the tools, keeping the forge lit and the benches cluttered with half-finished work. What had begun with a widow's determination to survive after her husband's death had grown into something much larger, a lasting silver echo that would carry the Bateman name long after she herself was gone. Mainstream historical fact: Hester Bateman died in 1794 at the age of 82, 4 years after officially retiring from the business. Her death didn't mark the end of the firm. Instead, her children, most notably Peter, William, and Jonathan, continued under the Bateman name, registering their own marks and ensuring that the household workshop evolved into a multi-generational enterprise. In fact, the Bateman name remained active in the London silver trade well into the 19th century. Her silver, modest though it often was, survived in extraordinary numbers. Unlike ornate ceremonial pieces locked away in treasuries, her spoons, sugar tongs, and teapots were scattered across countless homes. They were used daily, cherished, passed down through families, and eventually collected as antiques. Today, collectors can identify Bateman silver by its restrained elegance and consistent quality. and museums around the world preserve examples stamped with her initials HBA, tiny, permanent reminder of her steady hand. Here is a quirky tidbit. Bateman's silver became so reliable that some collectors of the Victorian era, decades after her death, deliberately sought out her hallmark to build matching sets from scattered pieces. It meant that Hester's work, once sold quietly through shopkeepers and merchants, became part of a secondary market of admiration she never lived to see. Imagine her initials struck into a spoon in 1765, still being noticed, admired, and cherished 70 or 80 years later. That's not just craftsmanship, it's endurance. Historians still argue whether her legacy should be measured in artistic innovation or in sheer survival. Some dismiss her work as plain, emphasizing that she followed trends rather than leading them. Others argue that her genius lay exactly therein, understanding her market, producing elegant pieces for ordinary households, and building a family business that outlasted her. But perhaps the truth is simpler. Her legacy isn't in stylistic debates, but in the quiet fact that her silver still exists in astonishing numbers, to survive centuries of use, polishing, and inheritance is an achievement in itself. Picture one of her spoons today, resting in a glass case at the Victoria and Albert Museum. The surface is still bright, though worn faintly by the hands that once stirred tea or sugar. The hallmark is clear lion passant, leopard's head, date letter, and HB. That spoon has outlived its maker by more than 2 centuries. Yet, in its tiny stamp, her story continues. A widow's initials, once pressed out of necessity for survival, now serve as her signature across time. Imagine also the hundreds, maybe thousands, of pieces not in museums, but in homes tucked in drawers, wrapped in cloth, pulled out for special occasions. Some owners may know the name Bateman. Others may simply appreciate the shine of an old family heirloom. In either case, Hester's touch endures. Her silver is still part of daily life, even if unnoticed, echoing her quiet persistence in kitchens, parlors, and display cabinets. Her legacy also lived through her children. Peter and William registered their marks as Bateman brothers, producing silver under the family name well into the early 1800s. William, in particular, developed a reputation for refinement, expanding the firm into new designs. Hester's daughters, though less visible in records, likely passed down stories of their mother's endurance, preserving her example within the family. In every case, the Bateman name carried on, rooted firmly in the foundation she had built. And what does it mean for us, drifting toward sleep, to linger on this story? Perhaps it means that legacy is not always loud. It is not always about wealth, fame, or dramatic invention. Sometimes legacy is a teaspoon, simple and plain, used quietly in the daily ritual of tea. Sometimes it is initials, struck again and again until they outlast the woman who bore them. Sometimes it is the echo of a widow's resilience, carrying her family from fragility into permanence. Hester Bateman's life was not one of spectacle. It was one of steadiness. She began in obscurity, endured widowhood, raised children, ran a workshop, and left behind silver that still whispers her presence. The echo is not grandite, is soft, like the shine of polished metal in candlelight. And perhaps that is why it endures so well. So, as you picture her final years and her lasting legacy, let the gleam of her silver fade gently in your mind. A spoon here, a teapot there, a sugar tongue polished smooth by centuries of hands. They are small echoes, yes, but together they form a lasting chorus. And within that chorus is the quiet life of Hester Bateman, the widow who stamped her name onto history in the tiniest, most enduring way possible. Now, as our journey with Hester Bateman comes to a close, let your thoughts slow, like the gentle dimming of candle flames at the end of a long evening. Picture the silver we have followed through her life, simple spoons, modest candlesticks, quiet teapots, glimmering faintly in the half-light. One by one, they fade into shadow, their shine softening until it feels less like metal and more like memory. The sounds of her workshop, toother, steady clang of hammers, the scrape of files, the hush of polishing cloths grow quieter now. They don't stop abruptly. They simply dissolve into the air, like the final notes of a lullaby. You might imagine the last apprentice leaving for the night. The fire cooling in the forge, the tools set aside, resting as if they, too, have earned their sleep. London's noise outside softens as well. The markets close, the carts roll more slowly, the bells grow distant. The city becomes a murmur, a backdrop to the stillness settling inside the Bateman household. At its center, an older woman sits quietly, her story complete, her silver already carrying her name forward into centuries she would never see. And now, you, too, can let go of the details, the hallmarks, the commissions, the patterns of Georgian taste. You don't need to hold them all. They will still be there, echoing faintly in history. All you need now is the quiet comfort of rest. The same rest Hester herself must have sought after long days at the bench. So close your eyes, let the light dim. Let the rhythm of her silver making fade into the rhythm of your own breathing. Her story is finished, and your night of rest can begin.